You know, there's something rather fascinating about the way we've arranged modern life. We've created a world where being alone for even a few minutes feels like some kind of punishment. We reach for our phones the moment we wake up, fill every silence with podcasts or music, schedule our days so tightly that there's no space left for simply being with ourselves. And yet we wonder why we feel so disconnected, so restless, so fundamentally uneasy in our own skin. I want to suggest something that might initially sound terrifying. What if the thing you've been running from your entire life, this dreaded state of being alone, is actually the doorway to the most profound freedom you'll ever experience? What if your fear of solitude is precisely what's keeping you from discovering who you really are? Let me tell you about David, a man who hadn't spent a single evening alone in over 15 years. Not because he was particularly social or popular, but because he had become so terrified of his own company that he would accept any invitation, watch any mindless television show, scroll through any social media feed, rather than sit with himself in silence. His mornings began with immediately checking his phone, filling his head with other people's thoughts before his own had a chance to surface. His commute was a constant stream of podcasts and music. His workday was packed with meetings and conversations. His evenings were filled with dates, social gatherings, or at the very least, the television droning in the background. And when he finally collapsed into bed, exhausted from all this external stimulation, he would listen to meditation apps or audiobooks until sleep mercifully rescued him from the possibility of encountering his own mind. David had become what I call a solitude refugee, someone so afraid of being alone that they live in a state of constant psychological exile from themselves. He was like a person so terrified of their own house that they spend their entire life sleeping on other people's couches, never realizing that the very place they're avoiding might actually be the most comfortable home they'll ever know. The irony, of course, is that all this running from aloneness hadn't brought David any closer to other people. His relationships were surface level, built on shared activities rather than genuine connection. His friendships were more like mutual entertainment arrangements, people he could call to avoid being alone, rather than souls he actually wanted to know and be known by. This is one of the great paradoxes of human experience. The more we run from ourselves, the less capable we become of truly connecting with others. When you can't bear your own company, you bring a kind of desperation to your relationships. You need others to fill the emptiness inside you, to distract you from the thoughts you don't want to think, to provide the constant reassurance that you exist and matter. But need is not love. Dependence is not intimacy. And relationships built on the foundation of escaping loneliness tend to be exhausting for everyone involved, because they're not really about celebrating who you are, but about avoiding who you fear you might be. David's awakening came during what he thought would be the worst week of his life. He had planned to visit his family, but a sudden illness forced him to cancel. His friends were all out of town or unavailable. His usual distractions seemed suddenly unappealing. For the first time in years, he found himself facing an entire weekend with no plans, no one to call, nowhere to go. At first, the panic was almost overwhelming. His chest felt tight. His mind raced through every possible activity, every potential distraction. He considered going to random social events, calling distant acquaintances, even working overtime just to avoid the terrifying prospect of being alone with himself. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was exhaustion from years of running. Perhaps it was curiosity about what he was so afraid of. Or perhaps it was the simple recognition that all his strategies for avoiding solitude had left him feeling more isolated than ever. So he stayed home. He turned off his phone, shut down his laptop, and sat in his living room in complete silence. And for the first 10 minutes, it felt like he might die. His mind immediately began its familiar commentary. This is boring. This is pointless. This is a waste of time. Then came the anxiety. What if something important happens and I miss it? What if someone needs me? What if I'm missing out on something better? Then the deeper fears surfaced. What if I really am as empty as I feel? What if there's nothing interesting about me when I'm not performing for others? But David stayed with it. He didn't try to meditate or do anything spiritual. He just sat there breathing, letting his mind do whatever it wanted to do, observing the whole internal drama with a kind of detached curiosity. And then something extraordinary began to happen. After the initial storm of anxiety and mental chatter, a different quality of attention began to emerge. It was as if he had been living in a house with the radio turned up so loud that he had forgotten what his own voice sounded like. And now, in the silence, he was beginning to remember. For the first time in years, David heard his own thoughts without the constant interference of external input, not the reactive thoughts triggered by news or social media or other people's conversations, but his own authentic responses to his own immediate experience. He noticed things about his apartment he had never seen before. He became aware of sensations in his body that had been drowned out by constant stimulation. He remembered interests and curiosities he had abandoned in his rush to stay socially connected. Most surprisingly, he discovered that he was actually quite good company. When he wasn't desperately trying to entertain himself or escape from himself, when he wasn't judging every thought or feeling as evidence of his inadequacy, he found that his own mind was full of interesting observations, creative ideas, and genuine wisdom. This is what most people never discover about solitude. They think it means being stuck with a boring, anxious, inadequate person, namely themselves. But this is only true when you're relating to yourself the way you've been taught to relate to yourself by a culture that values performance over presence, productivity over peace. When you actually spend time alone without judgment, without the pressure to be entertained or distracted, you begin to encounter not the small, frightened self that's been running the show, but a deeper, calmer presence that has been waiting patiently beneath all the noise. David spent the rest of that weekend rediscovering this presence. He took long walks without music or podcasts, simply noticing what he noticed. He cooked a meal and actually tasted it, rather than eating while scrolling through his phone. He sat in his garden and watched the light change as the day progressed. He read a book, not because it was trending or because someone recommended it, but because something about the cover caught his eye and made him curious. Each of these simple activities, done in solitude, had a quality of richness and depth that his packed social schedule had never provided. It was as if he had been eating fast food his entire life and suddenly discovered what fresh, lovingly prepared meals actually tasted like. But perhaps the most profound discovery was how this quality time with himself affected his relationships with others. When Monday came and he returned to his social life, he found that he no longer felt desperate for company. He could enjoy his friends without needing them. He could appreciate conversations without having to fill every silence. He could be present with others because he was finally present with himself. This is the secret that people who are comfortable with solitude understand. Loneliness and aloneness are completely different experiences. Loneliness is the feeling that something is missing, that you are incomplete, that you need something or someone outside yourself to make you whole. Aloneness is the recognition that you are already complete, that you contain within yourself everything you need for contentment, creativity, and peace. When you're comfortable being alone, you discover that you're never really alone anyway. You're with the most constant companion you'll ever have, your own consciousness. And once you develop a friendly relationship with this consciousness, once you stop treating your own mind as enemy territory that needs to be constantly occupied by external forces, you find that it's actually quite delightful company. Think about it this way. You are the one person you will spend every moment of your life with. You will wake up with yourself every morning and go to sleep with yourself every night. You will share every experience, every thought, every feeling with this person called you. Doesn't it make sense to cultivate a good relationship with this companion? Doesn't it seem wise to learn to enjoy their company? But our culture has taught us the opposite. We've been conditioned to believe that our own thoughts and feelings are somehow inadequate, that our own experience is not enough, that we need constant input from others to feel valuable and alive. We've learned to treat solitude like a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be received. This conditioning goes deep. From childhood, we're taught that being alone is a punishment. Isolation is how we discipline children. Go to your room is the consequence of bad behavior. We learn early that being with others means approval, while being alone means rejection. Social media has amplified this conditioning exponentially. We now have constant access to what everyone else is doing, thinking, feeling. We can compare our quiet Saturday afternoon to someone else's exciting vacation photos. We can scroll through hundreds of people's curated highlights and feel like our simple, ordinary life doesn't measure up. But what if this is exactly backwards? What if the ability to be alone, to be content with your own company, to find richness in simple, unshared experiences, is actually one of the most sophisticated and mature capacities a human being can develop? I think of the great artists, writers, philosophers, and mystics throughout history. Almost all of them were people who spent significant time alone, not because they were antisocial or strange, but because they understood that creativity, wisdom, and spiritual insight tend to emerge in quietude. They knew that the deepest parts of themselves could only be accessed when the external noise was turned down and the inner voice was allowed to speak. Van Gogh painted his most famous works in relative isolation. Emily Dickinson wrote her profound poetry from the solitude of her room. Einstein made his greatest discoveries during long solitary walks. Buddha found enlightenment sitting alone under a tree. Jesus went into the desert by himself. All of these people understood something that our hyper-connected culture has forgotten, that the most important conversations happen when you're alone. David began to understand this as his comfort with solitude deepened. He started setting aside time each week for what he called dates with himself, periods where he deliberately avoided social contact and simply explored what it felt like to be alive without external input. He discovered that creativity flowed more easily when he wasn't constantly consuming other people's ideas. He found that his values became clearer when he wasn't constantly comparing himself to others. He noticed that his emotions were more stable when he wasn't riding the roller coaster of social dynamics. Most surprisingly, he realized that his relationships improved dramatically when he stopped needing them so desperately. When you're not afraid of being alone, you can be selective about your social connections. You can say no to invitations that don't genuinely appeal to you. You can leave situations that drain your energy. You can choose to spend time with people because you enjoy them, not because you need them to rescue you from yourself. This selectivity leads to much richer relationships. Instead of broad, shallow connections with anyone willing to help you avoid solitude, you develop deeper, more meaningful friendships with people who actually see and appreciate who you are. Instead of being in relationships out of fear of being alone, you can choose partnerships based on genuine compatibility and mutual growth. But learning to be comfortable alone requires practice, just like any other skill. If you've spent years running from solitude, your first experiences with it are likely to be uncomfortable. Your mind will resist. It will generate all kinds of urgent reasons why you need to do something else, be somewhere else, connect with someone else. This resistance is natural. Your mind has been conditioned to believe that constant stimulation is necessary for survival. When you remove that stimulation, the mind panics, like an addict going through withdrawal. It will tell you that this is dangerous, that you're missing something important, that you're wasting precious time. But if you can sit with this discomfort without immediately reaching for distraction, something beautiful begins to happen. The frantic energy of resistance gradually settles. The compulsive thoughts slow down. A different quality of awareness begins to emerge, one that is curious rather than anxious, spacious rather than cramped, peaceful rather than agitated. This is when you begin to discover what mystics have called the inner space, the vast, quiet awareness that exists beneath all the mental noise. This space has been there all along, but it's been obscured by the constant chatter of external input and reactive thinking. When you give it room to emerge, you realize that this inner space is not empty or boring. It's full of subtle intelligence, creative potential, and profound peace. I remember talking to an elderly monk who had spent decades living largely in solitude. I asked him if he ever felt lonely, and he laughed. "How can I be lonely?" he said. "I'm with the most fascinating person I know, myself. I've spent so many years getting to know this person, learning their stories, understanding their patterns, appreciating their quirks. I find my own company endlessly interesting." This is what becomes possible when you stop being afraid of being alone. You develop a genuine friendship with yourself. You become curious about your own thoughts and feelings, rather than trying to escape them. You learn to appreciate your own unique perspective on the world. You discover that you are not just good company. You are the most reliable, most understanding, most available companion you will ever have. And from this foundation of self-friendship, all your other relationships are transformed. When you're not desperately seeking others to fill an inner void, you can appreciate them for who they actually are, rather than who you need them to be. When you're comfortable with your own thoughts and feelings, you can be present with others' thoughts and feelings. When you don't need constant validation from outside, you can give others the space to be authentic rather than performing for your approval. The people who are most attractive to be around are almost always people who are comfortable being alone. They have a quality of self-possession, of inner stability, that makes them genuinely interesting company. They don't need to talk constantly, or be entertained constantly, or receive attention constantly. They can listen deeply because they're not frantically trying to escape from themselves. They can be silent comfortably because silence doesn't threaten their sense of identity. This is why learning to be alone is not antisocial behavior. It's the foundation of all genuine social connection. When you're comfortable with yourself, you can be truly available to others. When you know how to enjoy your own company, you can choose to share that enjoyment rather than demanding that others provide it for you. David eventually became one of those people. He went from being someone who couldn't stand his own company to someone whose presence was calming and centering for others. He still enjoyed social activities, but he chose them from a place of genuine desire rather than compulsive need. He still valued his friendships, but he appreciated them as gifts rather than necessities. Most importantly, he discovered that the person he had been so afraid to be alone with, himself, was actually quite wonderful company. Not perfect, not always entertaining, but real, authentic, and ultimately trustworthy. He found that his own thoughts, when not drowned out by constant external input, were often wise and interesting. He realized that his own feelings, when not immediately medicated by distraction, contained valuable information about how to live. The fear of being alone, you see, is really the fear of discovering that you're somehow inadequate or empty. But this fear is based on a misunderstanding. It assumes that your worth depends on external validation, that your reality needs constant reinforcement from others, that you're only real when you're being perceived and approved of by someone else. But what you discover when you spend time genuinely alone is that your worth doesn't depend on others' opinions. Your reality doesn't need external confirmation. You exist whether anyone is paying attention or not. You are real whether anyone validates you or not. In fact, you are more real when you're not performing for others' approval, when you're not adjusting yourself to meet others' expectations. This realization is profoundly liberating. When you know that you can enjoy your own company, that you can be content with yourself, that you contain within yourself all the resources for peace and happiness, you're no longer at the mercy of others' availability or approval. You're no longer desperate for connection because you're already connected to yourself, to your own experience, to the vast awareness that you actually are. And from this place of inner fullness, your relationships with others become celebrations rather than negotiations. You share your life because you want to, not because you need to. You connect with others because you enjoy them, not because you require them to complete you. So perhaps today you might experiment with this freedom. Perhaps you might spend an hour or even just 10 minutes in genuine solitude, not sleeping, not distracting yourself, not doing anything except being present with your own experience. Perhaps you might discover that the person you've been afraid to be alone with is actually quite good company. Because in the end, learning to be comfortable alone is learning to be comfortable with yourself. And being comfortable with yourself is the foundation of all genuine happiness, all authentic relationships, all creative expression, all spiritual growth. Everything you've been seeking outside yourself becomes available when you finally dare to look inside. The fear of being alone is really the fear of coming home to yourself. But home, as it turns out, is exactly where you've always belonged.